Okay, so I know some of you like these surveys. I like these surveys, so I want to go through a survey today on Muslim attitudes within Great Britain. And this was a survey conducted by comrades for the BBC for their Today programme, which is a Radio 4 programme, fantastic programme, the Today programme. And this involved a telephone survey, I should say, of 1,000 Muslims within the United Kingdom. And it was conducted on the 25th of February 2015. Now, before I go into the details of the survey, the questions that were asked in the honoured fashion that I have done with the last couple of these videos, let's just set the scene a little bit here, because it was reported, of course, it was reported by the BBC, and it was also obviously reported by the press. Now, SageLion has done a video on this poll, and I will link you to SageLion's video. He calls out the right-wing media in the UK for taking a kind of anti-Muslim slant, and that's fair enough. That's fair enough thing to do. In fact, if I show you from the Mail Online, their page on this, you can see the kind of slant that they took, which is the kind of slant that you would expect them to take. So fair call for SageLion for that. What disappointed me with regard to SageLion is the only link that he gave was to the BBC's website, and yet he failed to make any comment on the BBC's left-wing slant on this particular poll, which perhaps tells you more about SageLion than it does about anything else. And they were perhaps all slightly guilty of not being able to pick out the bias that's closer to our own views than the bias that's further away from our own views. So let me get on with the survey anyway. I'll come back to the BBC's reporting of this and give you a few comments on that in due course. I'll let you savour that little bit in case you find the actual statistical bit a little bit fucking boring. What I'm going to do is they've broken this down into 4 questions. Confusingly, each question consists of lots of questions. So quite why they've done it that way, I don't know. So let's deal with question 1 first, and then we'll take it from there. Let me just shrink myself down in my usual fashion, and we'll crack on with it. Okay, so question 1 on a series of statements. Do you agree or disagree with these statements about British society? And quite a fascinating group of questions. Some optimism in some of these questions, it has to be said. Some questions left hanging. The first question, I feel a loyalty to Britain. The first statement, I feel a loyalty to Britain. 95% of respondents agreed, yes, we do, we're Muslims and we feel some loyalty to Britain. That's got to be a heartening response. That's got to be a positive response and something worthy of reporting, I think. Next question that really interested me. Western liberal society can never be compatible with Islam. Only 20%, because this is something that a lot of us are concerned about. Are these two things fundamentally incompatible, Islam and Western liberal society? Only 20% of the Muslims polled said, no, I think that fundamentally these things are not compatible. That is a positive result. But there is a specific slant on that question, which you may have noticed, which it says Western liberal society can never be compatible with Islam. What does that suggest? It suggests, can Western liberal society change and adapt in a way that makes society compatible with Islam, rather than can Islam adapt in a way that modernizes it and makes it compatible with Western liberal society? You know what I would have liked to have seen? I would have liked to have seen 500 of these 1,000 respondents ask the question they were asked, and the other 500 asked the question, Islam can never be compatible with Western liberal society. And I think that would be a fascinating thing to compare the two. We don't know what the answer would be to that question. My suggestion, I'm kind of optimistic about this, is that it would still have got a positive reply, right? But maybe not as positive as the question that they did ask. And what a missed opportunity not to ask both questions. I don't think it would have been quite so positive, because the implication would have been, of course, that it's Islam that has to change to accommodate into Western liberal society, rather than Western liberal society accommodating the idiosyncrasies and the peculiarities, some of which don't seem on the face of it compatible with Western liberal society, but changing to accommodate those idiosyncrasies. So that would have been really interesting. A kind of missed opportunity, I think, there. The next question comes off as a positive. Muslims in Britain should obey British laws. 93% of respondents agreed with that. Yes, Muslims in Britain should obey British laws. That's a very positive response, but I will come back to this when we get to question 4, because there's something that's answered in question 4 that really kind of jars with that response in a way that's very, very interesting, and I can't decide why those two things jar the way that they do. So I'll come back to that a little bit later. The very last two questions answered within the scope of this larger question, overarching question 1. Britain is becoming less tolerant of Muslims, very much in the balance there, with about half of respondents each way. Prejudice against Islam makes it very difficult being a Muslim in this country. Again, very, very much in the balance. It seems as if Muslims themselves, maybe they just personally have very different experiences of that, or maybe there just really isn't a lot of that for them to go on, and they're just plumping for one or the other because that's kind of what people do. In my experience, I think that the UK over the longer period is becoming more tolerant of Muslims and Islam, the way that it becomes more tolerant of pretty much everything, of every lifestyle and every belief. We are becoming generally a more tolerant, I think, an accepting society, but at the same stage as a society, we're still willing to ask tough questions. Thank fuck we're still willing to ask tough questions when tough questions need to be asked, or at least some of us are still willing to ask tough questions. There are a group of people that would happily sweep tough questions under the carpet, but as a result of things like the Taliban, of Al-Qaeda, of ISIS, of terrorist situations, of things like the gunning down, the massacre of the people who work for Charlie Hebdo, which you question that are involved slightly later in this survey, tough questions arise. Those tough questions are going to be asked, and when tough questions of those sort are asked, it's going to make a few arseholes nip. It's going to make people feel a little bit uncomfy when those tough questions are asked. But I don't think that is a sign of intolerance. In some ways it's a sign of tolerance, because we want to get to the bottom of these issues. That's the end of question 1. Let's move on to question 2 within this survey. So question 2, do you agree or disagree with these statements about cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad? So a series of statements. Say the first statement, a lot to say about that, really fascinating. It is deeply offensive to me personally when images of the Prophet Muhammad are published. 78% of respondents agreed with that. 78% of Muslims who answered this survey said that they find it deeply offensive personally when a non-Muslim such as myself publishes an image of the Prophet Muhammad that they're not made to look at, right? It's not as if they're held there and say, look at this fucking image of the Prophet Muhammad. So they're not made to look at it. And nowhere does it say offensive image, intrinsically offensive image of the Prophet Muhammad. So it doesn't have to be an image of the Prophet Muhammad with a fucking great dildo rammed up his ass, right? It just says an image of the Prophet Muhammad. So that is sufficient. Somebody publishes an image of the Prophet Muhammad, and that is enough for 78% of Muslims to find that personally deeply offensive. And the only breakdown that I can make of that is it almost seems to be a conflation of two ideas. On the one idea, we have this idea of actually offensive cartoons and offensive images, which of course Charlie Hebdo does offensive images of the Prophet Muhammad, as it does of lots of other religious images. None of them seem to get off scot-free. Okay, so we've got the idea of the offensive image, but then we're conflating that with the fact that Muslims have this thing about idolatry. I suppose you could look at the way that Christians look at Jesus, but perhaps even more look at the way that Catholics look at the Virgin Mary and the way they idolize the Virgin Mary. And Muslims are really fucking concerned, it would seem, right, that they don't want to worship, they don't want to idolize things other than Allah. and that they're really concerned that if images were made of Muhammad, if Muslims make images of Muhammad, that they will start to idolise Muhammad. Now, I know what you're fucking thinking. In what world aren't they already? How can they talk about Muhammad the way that they do and then claim that they're not idolising Muhammad? But apparently, for whatever reasons, they're not. But if they were to have images of Muhammad, then they're scared that they could start idolising Muhammad. So I can understand why Muslims don't want to make images of Muhammad, because they don't want to start idolising, worshipping Muhammad and worshipping him through those images. Right? But in what world are the cartoons that people like Charlie Hebdo make of the Prophet Muhammad in any way going to lead Muslims towards fucking idolising the Prophet Muhammad? I would think that in some ways they ought to welcome those fucking images with open arms, because they act as an idolatry buster. If anything, they're more likely to make you not want to idolise the Prophet Muhammad. So it just seems as if that's a kind of conflation of two things there, and it needs to be separated. The offensiveness and the whole argument about whether it's okay to make an offensive image, and that's where it comes into Western liberal society, and the whole business of Muslims themselves not making images of the Prophet Muhammad, which doesn't need to apply to non-Muslims in any way, shape or form. So that was the first question there. The second question, organisations which publish images of the Prophet Muhammad deserve to be attacked. Happily, only 11% of respondents thought that, but 11% of respondents, just to counter that a little bit, is still 300,000 Muslims in the UK. It's still a city load of Muslims, right? So it's not as if it's nobody. It's still a significant number of people, albeit only 11%. Acts of violence against those who publish images of the Prophet Muhammad can never be justified. 24% of the respondents disagreed with that. They actually do think that acts of violence against the Prophet Muhammad can be justified. But the question that I really want to look at, we can go back to the BBC and the BBC's coverage, is the next one. I have some sympathy for the motives behind the attack on Charlie Hebdo in Paris, because this was the one that the BBC picked up on. This was the one that the newspapers picked up on. I'd already showed you the Daily Mail. I'll show you the Mail Online again. It will show you the kind of spin they put on it. Have a look at the spin the BBC put on it, and then let's have a little bit of a think as to how they viewed it. Let me show you the BBC's page on that. Okay, so this is the headline, that most British Muslims oppose Muhammad cartoon reprisals. Technically that is true. 62% of them didn't have any sympathy for the motives behind, but 27% did, and usually a headline goes where the story goes, and so in a way that headline suggests that we're setting a pretty fucking low level of expectation for British Muslims, does it not? If we're quite happy that 27% of Muslims sympathise with gunning down 11 cartoonists because you found their cartoons offensive, surely the 27% is the story, not the 62%. Imagine if a different question had been asked. Imagine if we just surveyed 1,000 people generally of the British public and asked them if they sympathised with killing and harvesting the morbidly obese for their blubber. Do you think the headline would read something along the lines of this? Most British people oppose harvesting the morbidly obese for their blubber. That the majority of British people oppose slaughtering the morbidly obese as a cheap source of winter fuel. A poll for the BBC suggests. I suggest that that is not what would happen, because our expectation is, and our expectation ought to be, that nobody is going to sympathise with slaughtering the morbidly obese to provide a bit of blubber, to provide a bit of fucking fuel oil. And it is the same thing with this. Our expectation ought to be that no fucker is going to sympathise with gunning people down because they have published a cartoon that you don't agree with. So surely the story is the 27% who sympathise, not the 62% who do not sympathise. And before we leave the BBC's page, I've got to take you down the bottom of the page, and that's the genuine page, not the page that I made up. And I don't want to overdo this, but I've got to go through this bit of analysis. The reporter, it's the same old bullshit trite cliche I've heard 100 times before. Islam is a religion of peace and love. And it was brilliant. As I'm reading that Islam is a religion of peace and love and not violence, the breaking news at the bottom of the page, and I promise you this is something that I haven't doctored. Islamic State group says it was behind attack on Dallas Prophet Muhammad cartoon event in which 2 gunmen died. Brilliant. That could not have fit even better, because I have to ask the question while we're on this. What the fuck does a religion actually have to do before it stops being regarded as a religion of peace and love? I don't want to pick on Islam with this, because it applies to, at least to Christianity, to exactly the same extent over the centuries at the very least, even if not in the present situation, right? But Muhammad was a war chief, so you can't base it on him. You can't base it on scripture, because there's plenty of calls for reprisals and violence in Islamic scripture, just as the same as there is in Christian scripture, just as the same as there is in Jewish scripture, which of course is Islamic scripture as well. The Old Testament, the Tanakh, is Islamic scripture. So what the fuck is it that a religion actually has to do before it stops being regarded as a religion of peace and love? We obviously don't judge it on who originated it if they're a war chief. We obviously don't judge it on scripture. We've obviously got to judge it on the action of its followers. And yet Muslims are at war with the secular world, at war with Christians, at war with Buddhists in some parts of the world, Hindus in some parts of the world, Sikhs in some parts of the world. What on earth? What on earth do you actually have to do before you stop being called a religion of peace and love? It's just bullshit. It is just political rhetoric bullshit, this religion of peace and love thing. I'm going to give you a quote from Sam Harris, okay, which I think pretty much says it all with regard to this. And this quote was from a piece called Losing Our Spines to Save Our Necks, which was back in 2008, and I think this is really, really well written. There is an uncanny irony here that many have noticed. The position of the Muslim community in the face of all provocations seems to be, Islam is a religion of peace, and if you say that it isn't, we will kill you. Of course, the truth is often more nuanced, but this is about as nuanced as it ever gets. I love this bit. Islam is a religion of peace, and if you say that it isn't, we peaceful Muslims cannot be held responsible for what our less peaceful brothers and sisters do. When they burn your embassies or kidnap and slaughter your journalists, know that we will hold you primarily responsible and will spend the bulk of our energies criticising you for racism and Islamophobia. Well, I'm slightly off the mark there, because I think most of the criticism for racism and Islamophobia actually comes from non-Muslim left-wing sources when things like that happen. But he is right. The peaceful contingents do hold you responsible. Well, what do you expect if you are going to insult Islam? Anyway, let's carry on back with the survey. I think I said quite enough on all of that. I understand the motives of those who launch attacks in the name of Islam because the religion has been insulted. 32% agreed with that. You know, I agree with that. There is a big difference. There is a qualitative difference between understanding the motives and sympathising with the motives. I have no truck whatsoever with anybody understanding the motives. You can understand the motives of any desperate, nasty, violent act. That is entirely different with sympathising with the motives. The same with the last question. I wasn't surprised that the attacks in Paris happened. No, neither was I. And what a terrible situation that we are not surprised that such attacks happen. So that rounds out question 2. Let's move on to question 3. Do you agree or disagree with these statements about life in Britain? That is question 3, and these are the statements, and some quite interesting statements, some positive statements. The first statement that they've been asked, I do not feel safe as a Muslim in Britain. And let me say, for all the bullshit, for all the rhetoric, for all the ranting, for all the criticism of Islam and the criticism of some Muslims and some Muslim stances, right, and that's all they are. They're not generalizations, they're not statements that I intend to apply to all Muslims. The last thing that I want is for anybody, whether they're a Muslim, whether they're a Christian, whether they've got a religious belief, whether they haven't got a religious belief, whether they've got a political belief, even if it's a political belief that I find somewhat odious odious, if they are the kind of person that is welcoming of other people, then I would not want them to feel in any way unsafe whilst living in the United Kingdom. Happily, only 14% of Muslims do not feel safe living as a Muslim in Britain. So that is something that I feel reassured about that. The next one, if I could, I would leave Britain and go and live in a Muslim country. Hell, if you'd asked me to put a percentage on that prior to the survey, I wouldn't. You could have gone anywhere from 10% to 90%, well, not to 90%, but I'd have probably said it's going to be somewhere between about 10 and 30%. 40%, 14%. So the majority of Muslims are happy living in Britain. They feel safe. They like living in Britain. They'd rather live in Britain than a Muslim country. So that's a fantastic thing. I'm really pleased about that. The next one, it is appropriate that Muslims who convert to other religions are cut off by their family. Very surprised, only 17% thought that they should be cut off from their families. And I say surprised. There was a survey done in 2007. I'll highlight it on the BBC's. This was it reported on the BBC's website. In that particular survey, they were asked about the penalty of apostasy. Should the penalty of apostasy from Islam be death? So never mind cutting you off from the fucking family. Should you be killed if you abandon your religion? 36% of Muslims in the youngest category polled, 36 fucking percent of young British Muslims thought that the penalty of apostasy should be death. I nearly choked when I read that. But even in the over 55s category, that had the smallest percentage, 19% thought the penalty for apostasy from Islam should be death. Doesn't really tally in any way, shape or form, unless the respondents to this poll thinks, well, they don't need to be cut off from their family because they deserve to be killed anyway. We'll kill them, then they don't need isolating from their family. I'm assuming that isn't the point. So either attitudes are changing, or it's one of these things where it very much depends how you ask the question as to the kind of answer it gets. So it'd be quite interesting to see that other question asked now and see if attitudes have changed or quite what's going on with that. Because I think while we're on this subject, this kind of crystallises one of the genuine fears, if you're talking about Islamophobia, one of the genuine fears that people do have, that non-Muslims do have with Islam. And so it is one of the things that needs to be tackled, is that it always appears to be a kind of one-way fucking ticket. It's a little bit like sort of single-party communism. You can democratically vote for it, but there's never any way back again. And so, whereas, if you want to lose your religion, if you want to lose your religion, if you're a Muslim and you lose your religion, you want to be an atheist as far as atheists are concerned, fine. If you want to become a Christian, become a fucking Christian. Knock yourself out. If you're a Christian and you want to become a Muslim, if you're an atheist and you want to become a Muslim, nobody's going to fucking stop you. Nobody's going to say you should be beheaded for doing so. Nobody's going to say. They're just going to say, well, if that's what you really believe, you just crack on with it, right? There might be some people that don't want to associate with you anymore, but nobody is going to suggest that you're going to die for doing so. And it kind of puts the willies up people, because it seems as if it's a kind of one-way ticket. It's a kind of bottomless pit from which there is no return. So I think this is quite a kind of key issue here. So this, to me, this 17% result, even though 17% in some ways is quite high, it seemed a kind of a positive result. The last one on this, I would like my children to go to a Muslim state school if I had the choice. 31% agreed that they'd like their children to go to a Muslim state school. All I can say with regard to state-sponsored faith schools, state-sponsored faith schools, if you want a fucking faith school and you want to fund it, that is absolutely fine. But it's one of the things, perhaps the thing that embarrasses me most about this country, is that we actually have state-funded faith schools. We don't have state-funded astrology schools. We don't have state-funded conspiracy theorist schools or state-funded left-wing schools or right-wing schools. Why the fuck we state-funded funding schools that specialise in one particular brand of religious mythology. It's just one of these things that I would love to see go, but for cultural reasons it's perhaps just a little bit difficult, tragically difficult to get rid of. That's question 3, just one more question to go, so let's have a look at question 4. For each of the following statements, please tell me whether or not they apply to you. And before I get to those statements, if you've got this far in the video, thank you for continuing to listen, because I know it's been a bit of a troll, but I think this is really, it's where it starts to get a really bit confusing as we get into these questions. The first few are fairly straightforward, promising, good answers, the kind of answers that I'd welcome. I feel sympathetic towards people who want to fight against Western interests. Only 11% agreed with that. 85% said, no, that doesn't apply to me. I don't feel sympathetic towards such people. That's a kind of answer that I think we'd all welcome. I know Muslims, other Muslims, right, who feel strongly sympathetic towards people fighting for IS and Al-Qaeda. 89%, no, that doesn't apply to me. They don't. They're claiming that they don't know such people. So I think this is painting a picture, right? They're not the kind of people that would get involved in any of this. As we saw in question 2, 93% of the Muslims surveyed believe that Muslims in Britain should always obey British law. We know that 85% don't feel sympathetic towards those who fight against Western interests. And then we find, if I knew someone from the Muslim community was planning an act of violence, I would report them to the police. 94% would report them to police. 94%. I would imagine if you asked, you know, any other fucking group, you're not going to get 100%, are you? You're going to get people who have their little issues, right, who would say, nah, I probably fucking wouldn't. So that just seems a really good result. But then have a look at this. Then have a look at this question. This is where it gets confusing. Muslim clerics who preach that violence against the West can be justified are out of touch with mainstream Muslim opinion. 45% of respondents disagree with that. They believe that no, actually, Muslim clerics who preach violence against the West aren't out of touch with mainstream Muslim opinion. That doesn't fit with all these other things, does it? 45% of Muslims actually think that the preaching of violence is in step with mainstream Muslim opinion. But as they've answered the questions themselves, it's clearly for the majority out of step with their opinion as they've stated it, and clearly out of step with the statistics as they're being reported throughout this survey. So that really leaves me scratching my head. And I can think of 2, I've thought about this for a few days, and I can think of 2 alternatives here. The first is that the people who are answering this survey are effectively speaking with forked tongues. They're saying one thing, but they mean another. It's perhaps, and we could all understand this, they want to show Islam in a good light, and they want to show Islam in a way that to us will appear a good light, and so they're giving us the answers that they think will show their religion in a good light. So when they say some of these things, like they don't feel sympathetic towards those who fight against Western interests, some of them are lying, and they really do sympathise with these things, but they're saying the box that they think will reflect best on their religion. That's one of the alternatives. The other alternative, and this is perhaps even more interesting, is that people will say, well, non-Muslims, especially perhaps people to the political right, don't understand how Muslims actually think, right, and don't understand Muslims' opinions. But the only alternative I can see, other than people lying in this survey, is that Muslims themselves don't understand how their communities think. In other words, they see themselves as upstanding, as not sympathising with things such as ISIS and Al-Qaeda, but they see, and the Muslims that they know as not sympathising with those things, but they see the larger Muslim community within the UK, and they think, no, actually, I think quite a lot of them do, because otherwise, why would they give this answer about Muslim clerics that preach violence? Why would they say no? Muslim clerics that preach violence, 45% say that no, they are in step with mainstream Muslim opinion. In other words, they're not in, as a Muslim, they're not in step with my opinion, but they're in step with the opinion of a great deal of other Muslims. Not as reported on this survey, but as they feel about it when they're asked the question. So which one of those is the truth? Is it that people are lying towards the survey, or is it that the Muslim population themselves don't really understand what other Muslims think and actually have a worse impression of their fellow Muslims than is actually the case? Well, that's probably the most interesting thing that I could derive from this survey. Quite an interesting survey. I hope you've got something out of this video, and thank you for watching. Bye for now.